Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens.
Welcome to another episode of The Eurofile. Today, we're going to talk about a big week for Europe. First, we'll talk about a big week in European elections and European politics as a whole. The European Parliament elections are happening this weekend, and we'll talk about that first. Then we'll turn to Rishi Sunak's decision to call an early elections in the UK on July 4th, before discussing briefly President Joe Biden's visit to France. Then we'll turn to a conversation with Dan Kelemen, who holds the McCourt Chair at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University and is a non-resident affiliate with the Europe-Russia-Eurasia program here at CSIS. We hope you enjoy the show. All right, Max, let's start with the big one. This weekend, citizens in the European Union are going to the polls to elect the new 720 members of the European Parliament. What's your view on what's about to happen?
Well, it seems that not much has really moved in a lot of the polling. I think it remains that the expectation is that the EPP, the center-right party, is going to do quite well. The Social Democrats are going to be the second largest party, basically the same amount that they got in the previous elections. But the big shift will be, and we talk about this in our interview with Dan coming up, is that the far right is going to surge, and that's going to come to the detriment of both Renew and the Greens. We'll see if that's what shakes out. Of course, this is going to be a bunch of national elections, so how big is the repudiation to Macron in France? I think is one big question. But it's a lot of little national elections, a lot of little national midterms. The Belgian election, I think, is going to be quite important. I want your thoughts on that. And then it sort of gets compiled together. But I think the real drama here is probably not the vote, but what will happen afterwards, and then the kind of party groupings. Does Meloni align with Le Pen? Is there any sort of complications for von der Leyen to be sort of anointed to her second term as Commission president? Will there be a defense minister or a defense commissioner? All these things are going to happen afterwards. So that's where I think, in some ways, that's the real drama of the election. It feels like we kind of know how they turn out. Now, it could be that the polling's all off, but I think people are now sort of focused on what will happen afterwards. And, there's a lot of horse trading, I think, beginning to start behind the scenes in Europe. But curious for, what your thoughts are as a Belgian voter.
Well, I think you're exactly right on the aftermath really being the big deal. We have a good sense. I think the polling is probably fairly accurate. It's going to be a question of whether Renew or ECR is first, and they're going to jockey between that. But the consequences are really what matters. One, because, as you said, is a question of, is von der Leyen going to be the one at the helm again? For months, it's been all but assured that she's going to be anointed again. And in the last couple weeks, there's been a lot more rumblings of disagreements or people like Macron starting to, according to reports, we should be clear, letting his allies put in somewhere in the press that maybe they're considering Mario Draghi and floating him as a name for Commission president. So there's a lot of complications there for her. She's a little bit stuck between a rock and a hard place, though, because pure math, she needs 361 votes in the European Parliament to be elected Commission president. And that's going to depend on which groups she can get to align behind her. If the ECR grows a lot and she tries to go in that direction, she's going to lose votes from the Socialists, from the Greens, who have said do not align with right-wing and far-right parties who are in ECR. But if she tries to go further left, then some members of the EPP, her own party, are going to drop her. Same thing from the ECR. She's going to lose votes. So the math is going to be difficult. She's going to have to balance a lot of promises she's about to make to a lot of these groups. So I'll be very curious to see how that works. I think that math will be a lot harder for her in the European Parliament than it will be in the Council, because she does have the confidence of a lot of leaders there.
One just quick thought on that it occurs to me that Germany, if Scholz and therefore the socialists at the European level don't back her, And Schultz has drawn sort of a firm line of don't make an agreement with the far right, von der Leyen. But if Schultz doesn't back her, then Germany essentially lose the Commission president. And I think that is enough of a deterrent. And my guess is they'll figure out a way to make this happen. And I think it's probably in both EPP and the socialist interests, particularly after the results of the election, to figure out a way to get this done. But then I think once it's done, I could see von der Leyen, picking and choosing how she's going to sort of operate in a way that could quite anger people down the road.
She can, but she also has to get her full College of Commissioner approved. Now, obviously, it's not her picking all these people. Every country sends 2 names. If she does it the way she did it before, they have to send the name for a man and one for a woman. And then she looks at the candidates and then apportions, basically how you would do a cabinet selection. And that also has to be voted on. So just a brief timeline, really the decision on the Commission president is the first one. You also have to decide on the European Parliament president. They will be voting on their own president at the last plenary in July, last plenary of this session, I should say. That's a post that's for 2.5 years. The president of the European Council, which is currently Charles Michel, and he's leaving his post, and then the HRVP, which is currently Josep Borrell, who is not going to be doing this again. This has been announced. So mid-June, there's going to be an informal dinner where they really talk about the head, which is the Commission first and foremost. Then at the end of June, there's a formal European Council meeting where they vote on the European Commission president. There's a strategic agenda. And then from there, everything falls into place. And then the College of Commissioner comes up in the fall. But she has to manage those alliances very carefully in the meantime.
Yeah, I think one point of relevance for the U.S. audience is, the EU is basically about to go dark for a while, because it's going to be months of just kind of internal, slogging through. It's a bit like having a transition in the United States. So, nothing really happens between, September of our election year and January of the inauguration. So I think we're going to be in for to just, reading the tea leaves a lot. But I think this is a good segue to what was a rather dramatic announcement. Rishi Sunak sort of shocking everybody, especially in UK politics and especially in the Tory party, when he announced a July 4th Independence Day election. And so suddenly the UK, an election that I think, everyone had sort of put on their list as a major 2024, potentially 2025 election, is happening very soon. And it seems like it's going to be a bloodbath for the Conservatives. Nigel Farage has just entered the race, which probably isn't good for Rishi Sunak as well and should create kind of a lively debate. But Donatien, what's your kind of take on the upcoming UK election?
My initial take is, this is why I love UK politics. It's a wild land, and sometimes things happen and you think, as you said, not on my bingo card. Just did not think he was going to do this. If people are wondering potentially why he would do this, there are a few reasons that are somewhat sensical. One is the surprise element, because Labour has been the opposition, so they get all the attention because people are so unhappy with the Tories. But now they're going to have to be more detailed about their plans, and 6 weeks is just not a lot of time. 2, I think the Tories have made a lot of policy announcements recently that he's probably hoping to ride, from immigration to inflation figures. Immigration is also this way. There's going to be the first few flights for this wild Rwanda plan in early July, but they won't get to see the impact before after the election. I think the more grim reason is it's unlikely to get better for the Conservatives in the second half of the year, and he might be trying to maintain some form of legacy or reputation for the election that comes after that. And maybe he thought, it worked for Pedro Sanchez, let me give it a shot, except he is not Pedro Sanchez, and the conditions, the political conditions after 14 years of Conservative rule in the UK are completely different.
Yeah, I think this is always going to be an impossible election for Rishi Sunak, and I actually think that he's done an admirable job as prime minister in kind of recovering from the debacle of the Truss administration that didn't last very long, but in really trying to kind of normalize the UK-EU relationship in particular and sort of be kind of a steady hand at the wheel. But I think what is ultimately happening politically is that the Tory party is sort of split between the Boris Johnson Brexit move, which was to effectively become a more of a populist party that could win votes in the north and break up the quote unquote red wall, which the Tories succeeded doing as a result of Brexit, and Boris Johnson succeeded doing. But Brexit implementation and just leaving the EU was such a disaster that it's not only, I think, led to everyone turning against the Tories, creating an economic calamity, but it's caused the Tories to have to they're going back to the kind of traditional Tory approach with Sunak, and in some ways Liz Truss was like Margaret Thatcher on speed, and then that alienates the voters that you were trying to appeal to, these former Labour voters in the north. So they've lost that kind of populist wedge of Brexit, and they've alienated the kind of traditional Tory voters in the South, particularly in London. And so they have nobody. They've kind of lost their base. And I think what we're looking at here is just an epic landslide for Labour. And in some ways, it's rather exciting because the UK has just been drifting along for a number of years. It's been all about Brexit since 2016, very internally focused, fighting with the EU. But in the last 2 years, not much has happened. And now I think we're going to see a Labour government that's going to try to rebuild the UK-EU relationship, and particularly on defense. So we're probably going to be talking about the UK a lot more coming up because they're about to be relevant again, I think.
And to be clear, it's not a partisan message. It's just this is what happens when you want to have close to 15 years of the same party at the helm. It just becomes calcified. And exactly as you said, Brexit just sucked all the oxygen out of the room. So I agree there will be quite a few changes after this election, and we're looking at a massive landslide. So we'll definitely be looking at this more closely in the coming weeks. But why don't we turn now to our final news tidbit of this week, which is Joe Biden's visit to France. So what's he going to do there, Max?
I mean, the first thing, I think what's driving the trip is it's the 80th anniversary of D-Day on June 6th. The day this podcast comes out, Joe Biden will be there in France. And important symbolism. The U.S. came and saved Europe, single-handedly, forgot about what the Soviets were doing, and the Brits, I guess, were there too, and maybe some Canadians. But the U.S. commitment to European security, and then also connecting that with Ukraine. But then tacked onto this has suddenly been announced that there's going to be an official state visit of Biden to France. So Macron is saying, why don't you stick around and I'll take you around Paris and we'll have some, we got some good food. But I think there's a big question of what's actually going to come of the state visit. Are there any big deliverables to announce? The press secretary, Kirby, hinted that there would be some potentially around Ukraine, the Indo-Pacific. But to me, this trip could be really impactful, or it could be a nothing burger. I'm not sure what it will be, but impactful in the sense that in a few weeks, there's also going to be a European Council summit where the issue of Eurobonds is going to be on the table. Next week, there'll be a G7 summit where the issue of seizing, or at least seizing the profits from frozen Russian assets and potentially leveraging that to issue a bond of $50 billion for Ukraine. So all these efforts to figure out how to finance Ukraine are all being thrown about. And I think it would be really good if the U.S. and France can get on the same page and push in one direction. I think that direction should be both seizing frozen Russian assets and Eurobonds, and getting Biden to kind of really strongly endorse the Eurobonds would make sense. And then France could then strongly endorse the G7 proposal, could be one sort of trade. I don't know. That's pure just speculating, but I hope there's some sort of common vision for how the U.S. and Europe should be supporting Ukraine. So that's kind of what I'm sort of looking for. Is there going to be any movement in U.S. support for EU defense efforts or other things like that? So, we'll see. I mean, could be an important visit, or it's just sort of, cementing the bilateral relationship once again.
Yeah, I think aside from hard deliverables, it's a good signal. It's a good signal to send for Joe Biden to stay, to have a state visit. It's good for Macron to be able to have that to maintain that relationship. I don't think that's going to help him necessarily for his own election this weekend, because French people are notoriously anti-American. But as on the whole, even if they don't come out with grand proposals on the eve of all of these summits, it's still a good thing for the White House and for the Élysée to be organizing. On that note, why don't we turn to our conversation with Dan to talk about the European elections in a little bit more detail. We are thrilled to welcome Dan Kelemen back to the Europhile. Dan holds the McCourt Chair at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University, where he's also a professor of law at Georgetown Law. More importantly, in our opinion, he is a senior associate non-resident with our program, the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program. His research interests include the politics and law of the European Union, comparative politics and law, and comparative public policy. Dan, welcome back to the Europhile.
It's great to be with you, Donatien.
So why don't we start with the big picture? A lot of the polling we've seen coming out of Europe in the last few months and up until the election, no doubt, is that the far-right parties should be getting a pretty significant share of the vote across the European Union, really. There's some analysis looking at potentially 20 to 25% of the seats in the European Parliament, which obviously has made a lot of analysts a little nervous about what that means. But let's start there. What does that mean exactly? Is the panic or the worry justified? In your view, what is the implication of a potentially much larger far-right group in the parliament?
Yeah, I think that it will have a definite policy impact, but maybe not as big as what some of the forecasts are projecting, just in the sense that I think the center of gravity will still remain, and the majority that will effectively control the policy agenda will still be between the center-right European People's Party, as it's called, and the center-left Socialists and Democrats, or basically the Social Democrats, and then also the Liberals. So that kind of grouping will still dominate. However, the fact that the far-right will have a bigger presence than ever will have big impacts in many files where, especially if the main three parties of the center aren't in agreement, if they're not voting together, then you may see them looking further to the right for votes. I think in particular on things like EU migration policy and the Green Deal, I think we will see a policy impact.
Maybe we could break this down a little bit. Like what's changed? I'm looking at right now, Politico.eu has a really good poll of polls where you can kind of see how the polls have shifted. One that goes all the way back to the last election in 2019. And it basically looks like EPP, they got 174 seats last time. Now they're on track to get 175. And it looks like the major parties, EPP, the Socialists, are about to do basically the same as they did previously. Is it just that Renew, the party of Emmanuel Macron, of the Liberals, has really declined? Is that why the far right has increased? What are the kind of structural trends that have emerged here? Or are there any to really pull out?
Well, actually, the other one that's really declined is the Greens. The Greens had their best showing ever last time, and they are forecast to do very poorly this time and really lose a lot of their seats. And also, the Liberals, particularly because Macron's party in France, which is the biggest of the Liberals, are projected to do very poorly, and instead Le Pen will do well. And so it's really those two parties that are taking the biggest hit. And again, I think that centrist bloc will hang on to a thin majority, and that'll still be the center of sort of power. But the fact that the far right is going to be this huge weight within the parliament, it's both going to even maybe color some of the proposals coming from the governing coalition. Certainly the EPP has flirted with the parties to its right and adopted some of their policies and rhetoric, that sort of thing. And then in some cases, for particular files, actually those far-right parties will be probably part of the majority vote, on certain files.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about the campaign as it's unfolding. In some ways, there is a European-level campaign. There have been debates between candidates for essentially Commission President, von der Leyen, and her competitors. These have not really seemed to have galvanized the continent. Well, it really seems like we're having is a bunch of national elections. And I guess how would you characterize this campaign season compared to past European parliamentary elections? Are there any major differences from, in 2019?
Well, I think one difference is that in the last two cycles, and particularly last time in 2019, there was really more attention to this, what they call the Spitzenkandidat process, this idea that each of the parties would put forward a candidate at the top of their list who's kind of their nominee for commission president should their party come out on top. And that's still going on this time, but I don't think anyone's taking it as seriously. I think another thing I'd say about the campaign is really it reflects this character of the European Parliament and the party system in the Parliament, that it's really a half-baked political system. Because on the one hand, you kind of go through the motions. There's campaigns, there's Euro parties, there's even these nominees for the Commission presidency, etc. But, as you said, Max, really these are more national campaigns. They tend to get very little attention. So when they've had these debates among these lead candidates, I think the viewership is very low. And there is something ironic there because some of the polling, like latest Eurobarometers, indicate that there's high levels of public interest and voting intention among voters for the upcoming election. And yet the actual campaign process doesn't capture the imagination and the media attention on anything like the scale of national elections. So that, sort of reflects the underdeveloped or immature nature of European level democracy, that they sort of have the semblance of what you need for a democratic system, but not the engagement and energy and attention.
It's partly because if you're going into the ballot box in France, you get to ding Macron. You get to vote against Macron's party. You're not voting for or against von der Leyen. Or at least that's not the perception. The perception is, are you picking Marine Le Pen? Are you picking Macron? It's very much in the national terms. I know, Donatien, you're about to vote. How are you going to vote? And are you going to think about this in a European context or in a national context?
Well, I was going to add to your point, which is the lowest hanging fruit for voters, is to think about who am I voting for and against at my national level. Because going beyond that currently, and to Dan's point as well, in just the very immature nature of European democracy, it requires a lot of information on the voters' part to understand the connection between the national party and the party at the European Parliament. I know which Belgian parties are in which European Parliament parties, but that requires a lot of information. And I think national media ecosystems are also not well developed to address those issues, because national politicians are always going to play to what works best for them, which is if there's credit to be taken, they'll take it at the national level. If there's blame to be given, it'll be given to Brussels. But Dan, I'm curious for your thoughts on this.
Those are great points you bring up, Donatien. And yeah, again, back to this idea of the half-baked nature of this, party system and the voting system and EU-level democracy. Voters, first of all, they need a lot of information. They simply don't have it. I did a recent study with some colleagues in Switzerland, did a kind of survey. It was around 8,000 German and Italian voters. And we found over 70% of respondents couldn't tell you which Euro party their national party belonged to. Okay. So they don't even know. And in most countries, I think there might be a couple exceptions. I haven't checked lately, but I can tell you that in most countries, there is no insignia even of like the Euro party, the EU level party on the ballot or even on the posters, so parties are very much running national. And as you said, people are voting, thinking in terms of national politics. So even though the election has these pan-European implications, people have a hard time making that connection. And I think the other reason is it's just an aspect of EU-level democracy that I think we have to accept as inevitable, is that it's what political scientists would kind of call a consensus democracy. If you just think you got people voting in 27 different countries, all these parties, and basically that is going to generate an outcome in the parliament, which will eventually, create some kind of a majority. But from the perspective of voters, that's going to be a kind of big coalition of multiple parties. So if you think of like the simplest view of democracy, which is democracy is about, I go to the ballot box and throw the bastards out, right? Like if I don't like my current government, I can go and I can vote against them. And if enough of my fellow citizens do that, then we'll get a new government. Well, that's not exactly how the EU works, because it's a big consensus machine that needs super majorities from many countries. So the voters go vote and they may kind of hear, oh, the far right did better this time, or the left or the Greens did a bit better this time. But will that dramatically lead to a different government, so to speak, for the EU from one day to the next. No, that's just not how it works. That doesn't mean that there isn't democratic input and that votes don't matter, but it's not something where just a thin majority flips the system.
But isn't that kind of a core tension at the heart of the system then? Because we've been having conversations for 15, 20 years, I don't know, about making the EU more democratic. This comes up all the time. You mentioned it a little bit, but there's Eurobarometer surveys showing that European citizens want the EU to do more on a range of things, on climate. They're really interested in improving conditions when it comes to poverty and public health, all of these things. And at the same time, the stability and survival of the institutions kind of relies on this consensus machine, because wide swings in decision making would probably make it a really unwieldy machine. Don't you think?
Yeah, I think that's right.
It's a very leading question.
No, and I think what I would just add to that, or just kind of picking up on what you're saying, I think when you have a system that kind of consistently leans toward consensus and always kind of puts the center in command, on the one hand, that can be very stable, so there's good things about that. But then if you have a lot of frustration and polarization, that's what can encourage people to vote for sort of populists who say, hey, I'm going to smash this system down. All these parties, whoever you voted for, they've all had kind of roughly similar immigration policies, just to pick an example. We're going to come in and smash all that and say no to asylum, So, yeah, basically, a system oriented toward consensus can breed frustration, which can lead people to look for someone who promises something radically different. And that's, I think, a bit of what's going to explain this push to the far right this time.
We've sort of talked about how these elections are probably some of the problems with these elections in terms of really reflecting kind of the will of the European voter and how they work in practice. But one of the dynamics here is that they really matter in terms of determining essentially future policy, but also who will be in charge of the European Commission. Maybe we could talk about the impacts that this election may have. Now, maybe we could start with breaking down the far right and what the implications will be there. There's been some news recently that Marine Le Pen's National Rally and AFD will not be joining forces under a European political grouping of ID. And that leads to big questions about whether the far right can actually unify and get their act together. Dan, I'm curious what you made of that and how you think that will impact things going forward if the right can actually sort of unify in any kind of common positions.
Yeah, I mean, this has been one of the fears of those who are afraid of growing far-right influence in Europe for a long time, is that the far-right parties on a pan-European basis would all be able to unify and therefore become one of the largest blocs, et cetera. Now, so far, basically, just to map it out, the far-right in the EU level is divided into two main parties. There's one called the ECR, the European Conservatives and Reformists. They have a reputation of being a bit more, let's say, nationalist, a little Eurosceptic, but not all of them, fit exactly the far right label. Some do. So they have like the Brothers of Italy, Meloni's party is the biggest there. Law and Justice from Poland's another big party, etc. The Tories used to be in there back when they were in the EU. But anyway. And then the Identity and Democracy, what you're calling Identity, that's the more classic sort of far right. And they have Liga from Italy. They have Le Pen's Rassemblement National, and they have AFD until, as you mentioned, this rupture we just heard about. They have the Austrian Freedom Party, etc. So, okay, those are the two big blocks. And really what's one of the interesting things about these elections, it's not just that everyone's looking at how those two parties will do, but then there are questions about, would there be defections, right? Would some parties move from one to the other, right? Or then also could one imagine, let's say, some kind of ECR, that's the conservative ones, allying with the EPP, which is the center-right? Could one imagine, like, Fratelli d'Italia sometime leaving the ECR, going to the EPP? Those are the things that people are speculating about, both which coalitions would be possible, but also which moves, where national parties can ditch one Euro party and move to another. And all that is in play right now, right? And then also there's the kind of wild card of Viktor Orban's Fidesz party isn't in any party right now, and they're looking for a new home. Quite possibly could be the ECR. But I think to kind of answer your question after setting all that out, I think in the end, there may be some movements. We may have a couple parties. We could get into details we want that might switch. But I do not think in a broad sense that ECR and ID will join or merge. Nothing like that. There's too many divisions over things like policy on Russia, some other issues. And so I still think in the end, there'll be this division within the far right.
It also seems to me that we may be facing, instead of durable coalitions, let's say with one big platform for the next 5 years, it could be more of a flexible coalition making depending on the issues. That would be really interesting to see. Obviously, we've seen the EPP shift its position on the green transition, especially when it comes to land use, sustainability, also because of all these farmers' protests, and ECR has benefited from that a lot. But I think we could see something that in a way kind of brings it closer to some more normal, quote unquote, democracies across Europe. So that's something I'm curious about. But if I can get wonky for a second, just because I want to bring it down to the practical level, beyond the coalitions that this could form in the European Parliament, what kind of impact do you see in the institutions themselves? Does it matter that, let's say, ECR could get more VP seats or something like that? Or what does that mean for the Commission?
First, how it matters for the institutions. So the composition of the parliament matters, and the size of these Euro parties matters for things like chairmanships and vice chairships of committees, things like that, which does have real influence on the nitty-gritty of policymaking, right? And so it matters there. The parliament, of course, has to approve the commission, right? And the commission leadership will tend. So, for instance, if, as we can all expect, the EPP is the largest party, then that means the commission president will be EPP, most likely von der Leyen. And then likewise, if, let's say, the socialists are second biggest party or, things like that, then you typically get these senior positions like vice presidents of the commission, coming from those. So the doling out of the positions in the commission does to some extent reflect power in the parliament, but not purely so, because of course, governments have to nominate the commissioners, right? And so you'll only get like far right commissioners from far right governments. Okay. So yes, like Italy, Meloni will send some Fratelli person, presumably, that sort of thing, right? But that's where, the commission sits in this position kind of between the council, which is the governments, and the parliament, right? But its composition isn't purely determined by the parliament by any means. Just to go back to the first thing you said, I agree that on some policy issues, we may see the EPP, which is, I still think, going to be the dominant party. We may see them looking for allies on the right to get things passed, on whether it's on migration, on things to do with agriculture and Green Deal. And I think more generally, the game that's being played, the kind of key game that the EPP is playing, and this is something we see nationally too, that everywhere that you have the rise of far right parties, the question becomes, for the center right, do you have a cordon sanitaire? You have a red line where you say no cooperation with the far right, or do you kind of normalize them and say we could work with them, etc.? That question is repeated at every level of government in Europe, right? And that question faces the EU right now. And I think the EPP, which is the main center right party, has made it really more and more clear that they are open, potentially. Von der Leyen said this in one of the debates, to cooperating with the ECR, et cetera. So they're sort of indicating that openness.
Maybe as a last question, the European Union has been this sort of legislative machine. It's a kind of remarkable how much legislation is passed. The AI Act recently just came into law. Now, it strikes me that the European Parliament has been one of the major advocates or forces in favor of sort of supporting European integration, really pushing the European project along. The danger here with the far right isn't so much kind of the death of the European Union and the EU sort of breaking down. It sort of strikes me a little bit more like an American election where suddenly, one branch, the House of Representatives may flip to the Republicans, and the idea that a Democratic president's going to pass anything sort of flies out the window. Is that how to think about this election, that if the far right really emerges, that, the EU on climate legislation, energy legislation, well, it may have
turn to page. It's sort of, the EU will have what it's done over the last 5 years. It's not going to maybe do that much more in the next few years going forward because of the makeup of this parliament. And we may not just see a lot of action when it comes to efforts to really advance the European project and the sort of legislating on the front foot that we've seen from the European Parliament. Maybe it'll slow down a little bit. But then in general, we're not talking about the kind of end of the world for the European project. Quibble with that assessment, fight that assessment, or agree with it. However,
no, I wouldn't fight that assessment. And the first thing I'd say, it is really striking. If we take a step back, and we're doing this broadcast from CSIS, I guess a lot of our audience is Americans, and it's worth thinking about, with two political parties in one language, we still manage to get mired in gridlock, and our Congress barely passes legislation anymore, right? It is remarkable that the European Parliament, with dozens of parties, dozens of languages, all this fragmentation across the spectrum, continues to be a legislating machine, right? That churns out, far more significant legislation than U.S. Congress, right? So it's very impressive. And I think at its core, basically that will remain the case, right? They still will be producing more legislation, et cetera. I just think the combination of the greater presence of the far right in the European Parliament, where their votes may be needed for some files, but also just their presence there and the threat that poses to the center right will affect the content of policy, so that on things like climate, anything will be far less ambitious. And in fact, we'll probably see watering down of some existing policies. And then on migration, they've just reached the migration pact just now, but I think we'll see, again, pressure for watering down things there. And so I think the machine will not be ground to a halt, but it will take on a more conservative tenor.
Dan, last final question. Will von der Leyen be the European Commission president? Your prediction?
If I had to put some euros down on it right now, I'd say yes. She's the odds-on favorite, but it's not a sure bet by any means. She hasn't been doing herself a lot of favors in this election campaign, and there's opposition, but I still think she's the odds-on favorite.
Well, Dan, thank you so much for coming back on the Eurofile, and please come back again soon.
I will, with great pleasure, Max. Thanks to you and Don Etienne.
That's it for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Our thanks to our producer, Sean Falk, and to Otto Svensson for coordinating and researching this episode. We'll be back soon with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. Until next time.